Hello and welcome to the Big Picture podcast brought to you by Ipsos. My name is Helen Bennis. Today we are discussing an increasingly important topic, the nature of online health information, the good, the bad and the ugly. This is split into a two-part series. In the first part of the series, we discussed the good, the value that accurate, ethical and regulated health information should have, and the bad, why this value has not been realised. In this second part of the series, we will discuss the uglier side of online health information, when and what harm inaccurate, unethical, and unregulated health information can cause. And we will also discuss some of the techniques and advice on how to mitigate these risks, both the individual and for organisations. I would argue it's not just because you had a following, but because you had a following because of what you were putting out obviously resonated with people as well. So it's not just the following there.
But still, just on that point, imagine if someone had gained that following artificially, then they're being given these book deals and they have a voice that maybe they're not really entitled to.
And we mentioned the other day about incentivization as well, which is along the same vein. So companies paying influencers to promote.
Yeah. So I think a really interesting way of understanding the space is to understand how people use these technologies not only to communicate either their personal brand or some type of message, but also how they monetize their brand and how they monetize products and services. And again, this shifts constantly with the technologies that people use. But one of the real concerns that I've observed lately, especially with the research that I conducted on cancer misinformation, are the ways that people are using these link in bio tools to create these very compelling videos and then to direct people often through a flashing caption that will say link in bio to their personal webpage. And it's operating almost like a landing page. And there they'll sell all types of products, colloidal silver, ivermectin for animals often. They'll sell hydroxychloroquine lozenges. They'll sell breakfast supplements and allege that these cure cancer or autism. I mean, it's pretty concerning. And it's just such a highly unregulated space. But on top of that, it's just so straightforward for anyone with any degree of technical ability to be able to create these tools and to be able to monetize. And I think there is a real incentive there when people are so preoccupied with wealth and making a living to be able to, take advantage, I think, of very vulnerable groups who are looking for some type of remedy.
And that's the horrible thing and the unethical thing about all of this is it's typically vulnerable groups who are desperate, like really, really desperate. They'll do anything and they'll pay anything, probably money they don't even have, for techniques that aren't evidence-based.
Yeah, I was just watching a video the other day and this influencer does actually have a following on TikTok. So he's quite different from the smaller accounts I was mentioning that are just promoting products. But he had quite a long video on TikTok because they've extended the length of videos now on the platform. And he initially starts off about, describing, it's very similar, right? The personal anecdote. It's his own personal cancer journey and how he now is cancer-free and what he did and the protocols that he followed. And then he's using this story to be able to promote his breakfast solution. But then he adds in at the end a series of anecdotes, one of which is about his grandson, Daniel, who after 5 years of using this breakfast solution is now autism-free. And what broke my heart was not just his message, but then reading the comments and how many people were actually responding to him saying, how can I access this? What do I do? How long? They were really asking in detail about his protocol. And I thought that actually shows the desperation very vividly that people have, understandably, and the level of exploitation that is happening.
So there are ways and mechanisms in which people, audiences can be exploited or manipulated. What about thinking about those individuals who are engaging with information? What are the reasons, in your opinions, that people do believe what they see?
Yeah. I'd preface this by saying I don't think the internet is just this dark, nefarious place, even though a lot of what I study is dark and nefarious. I personally am really interested in health and wellness. I follow medical professionals and experts online like everyone else. And I think it can be really useful for people to be able to understand in an accessible way some of the health issues that either they directly experience or just some of the shifts in terms of how people are trying to optimize their health and not just their lifespan, but their health span, right? To have a more vital life if they reach their sort of 80s and 90s. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Again, it's just being able to discern which voices are more reputable. And then even for the reputable ones, really trying to understand the hype, because without naming names, there are doctors and scientists who I have followed in the past who I would consider to be reputable, and they have promoted certain supplements that actually aren't shown to be that effective. And so while they may not cause harm explicitly through illness or death, there are a lot of people who are unnecessarily buying things that they don't need to, or perhaps falling for the same ads that they may fall for, offline. And so I think it's just really trying to understand the incentives of people, whether they be medical professionals or, non-credentialized experts online.
Mm-hmm. I was going to jump in because just on that point, the irony for me is that I have been one of those people who has fallen for the advice of influencers, and this is a big part of what I talk about in my book, that when I left medical school, weight had never been a problem for me, and then all of a sudden, for various complicated reasons which I only understand now, I suddenly gained a lot of weight, which is a common experience for young doctors, and then my only obsession in life was weight, so I turned to the advice of, I call them fitfluencers, and I obsessively watched them, and I became completely engrossed in their stories. Instead of watching TV, I'd much rather watch a 20-30 minute YouTube video on this is what I eat in a day and follow me in my life, and you see every detail of their life, and it sort of feels like they're a friend, and you want to do what they do because they've obviously seen these incredible results, so why wouldn't you do it? And also I looked at it objectively as a doctor myself, and I thought, this seems logical. I can see that what they're eating, I mean, it looks like it's healthy, it looks like it should make me or help me lose weight, and all of the things that they're doing, I can see why it would work. And so I fell for it. And actually now it's only through, I've done a research scholarship on childhood obesity and obviously becoming a lifestyle medicine doctor, I understand the complexity and nuance of obesity research. I realize the health advice that I took on board from these fitfluencers harmed my health. And I just find it so ironic that someone who has a medical degree fell for it because I became attached to the individual. So we're all vulnerable to it, actually.
Well, we're all individuals, aren't we? But I was going to bring up the idea of, as people, we do overestimate our ability to critically appraise information.
I think that's absolutely true. And I'll often say exactly the same thing, that even as people who study this space, it's not always clear. You can think of the extreme examples, of course, and they're often used almost like a caricature, but in reality, most of the time it's more of a grey area. Ironically, I realize we're recording a podcast now, but some of the most problematic content is in the form of podcasts, where someone will be listening to say, well, I'm just thinking during the pandemic, there were some figures who were on Joe Rogan who, and he has wonderful guests sometimes, so this is not a criticism of him per se, but he would have guests on there speaking for 3 hours. And it's a lot harder for the average consumer to listen to a 3-hour podcast where they can qualify statements, they can go into details, not just telling their personal story. They're actually talking about many things, and it's really difficult for us to be able to discern when misinformation is necessarily being communicated. And there's debates among experts. And so I'm totally empathetic with the idea that people who don't either study this or they're not trained like you as a medical professional must find it even more confusing, because not only do they not necessarily have the training in it, they actually have people who are using advertising techniques of persuasion and influence to either trick or deceive, or to be able to encourage them to purchase something. And I think it's really important to always just come back to that idea of, like, whether you're looking at Instagram or TikTok, that there is a commercial aspect to most of these, and they're essentially branding platforms. And it doesn't mean that everyone on there is communicating, to use the terms that you were talking about, a bad or an ugly message. Not at all. There's great information out there too. But most people are actually trying to profit, whether they're trying to profit through commercial gain, political gain, or just social gain, clout.
Mm-hmm. And there are so many psychological flaws that we're all vulnerable to. So one of my favourite is the fact that if something costs more money, then automatically people don't even realise they're doing it. They think it's worth more and it's more valuable for their health. And we even see this with the placebo effect. So just one example is, if you take Parkinson's patients and you tell them, okay, well, we've got 2 drugs that we want to try out on you. This one's actually really expensive, but this one has a similar effect, but it's just much cheaper. You give it to them. The one that's more expensive will have a much stronger effect, but the strange thing is actually they were given nothing. It's just a saline injection. The reason it worked is because of the placebo effect. So the placebo effect affects your dopamine, and Parkinson's is largely driven by a change in dopamine signals. But they were given saline, and the one that was more expensive had a much more beneficial effect on the individual because of this kind of psychological flaw. And we do this all of the time as consumers. If there's any supplement, you will notice they tend to be very expensive. That supplement is going to work through the placebo on you very well because it's expensive. And this is one of the arguments I want to really push away from, because ironically, a lot of the healthiest people in the world happen to be very poor. And it's really insightful because they're not going to gyms, they're not buying expensive supplements, they're not living these lavish lives. They live very humble, simple lives, and have very low stress and incredible social connection, and very humble, simple food. So a lot of beans. I'm a big fan of beans. But how can I compete with an influencer who is glamorous and beautiful and thin? And that's the other psychological flaw. We tend to trust the appearance of someone. So if you have a really beautiful, glamorous, thin person who has the society's version of a desirable body, you're just automatically going to buy what they're selling you because you have this psychological flaw.
Yeah, and I would say with that example, I think it's a good one, but it's not even necessarily trust, it's aspiration, right? People are aspiring to be like certain people, and that's why these what I eat in a day videos are so popular, or these little insights and snippets that people get into other people's lives, because they want to be able to emulate them, both physically in some cases, but also in terms of embodying their lifestyle and their status more generally.
Yeah, and what's really sad is that society, they probably don't want to hear this because you can't profit off of this fact, but the shape of your body is heavily influenced by outside factors. So I talk a lot about epigenetics. That's the interaction between your genes and your environment, which heavily shape your risk of obesity. Your microbiome will massively shape it. So just as an example, there are some individuals who have a bacteria called Christensenella. I don't know if you've heard of it before. So 10% of the population happen to have this bacteria. No matter what you eat, you'll stay thin, and you also won't develop visceral fat. So these are people, we've all met them, who brag about how much junk food they can put away. And they say, oh, I just have one of those metabolisms, I just never gain weight. Potentially, I mean, there are lots of complicated reasons. It could be genetic as well. But one of the reasons might be they happen to have this Christensenella that completely spares them from gaining any weight. And one of my arguments with all of these fitfluencers is their disclaimer is, by the way, I'm not a medical professional, you should seek your own medical advice. I would say you are giving medical advice because you're telling people how to treat overweight and obesity. But your disclaimer should be, I have a personal microbiome. It might be keeping me thin for reasons that actually have nothing to do with me. And I have my own personal epigenetics, which might be keeping me thin. Again, nothing to do with how I'm living my life. It's my epigenetics versus yours. You can't compare these bodies, but society don't want to hear that because you can't profit off of them.
I would like to throw in another bias, confirmation bias. You look for things that confirm what you think.
Yeah, I mean, it's well documented. I think we see it in the literature a lot more around politics and religion in particular. But absolutely, the idea that you have for people who don't know, confirmation bias is this idea that you have a belief and then you'll find supporting evidence to confirm that. Yeah, we do. But I mean, I wouldn't see it as the sole driver here. I think there are so many different aspects at play when we look at how people trust health information, and it is absolutely one aspect of it. Mm-hmm. But I think possibly not as strong as other things that we've studied.
I suppose the access to information, though, allows you to find something on the wealth of information that you can see, allows you to always find something that will confirm.
And I think parents will probably relate to this, that what's really interesting now is we talk about, to go to your earlier point, democracy and the internet, democratizing information. But I'm struck by how much we're actually existing in silos. And if you look, for example, at my students, they're not really on Instagram that much. They're mostly on TikTok and Snapchat. And often I hear this a lot from parents of teenage boys where they'll follow certain accounts which are promoting, weightlifting or certain health techniques, might be a protein intake, and parents will try to intervene in some way, and they're told that they don't understand, that they don't know. And I think that's definitely one example of confirmation bias, where they can just go online and find that content. But again, we're just not all consuming the same content. People are going, largely based on demographics, to different platforms and different sites to consume information.
But even if you wanted to be really diligent and go find the research article that confirms your opinion, you always can, because historically to have a paper published, it would always need to be legitimate. But actually nowadays, researchers can pay money to have anything published. And it's actually that people have done experiments where they type up these completely ridiculous articles based on nothing, send it to a paper and just pay a certain amount of money, and it can be published. But that's why you need to know which journals are the reputable ones, and the general public don't necessarily know that. So I just caution everyone to acknowledge that if an influencer, for example, say, oh no, but there is this paper, just because there is a paper confirming your belief doesn't mean that it's true, because you don't know, again, who's funded that research, if it is real research, and has that paper is it just something that's been paid for?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyone who's publishing papers knows that there's essentially a hierarchy of journals in different fields, and there are some that are much more rigorous in terms of peer review, absolutely. One thing I was just thinking of as you were speaking, which I'm really sympathetic with from the consumer perspective, is that often people will see headlines, and I think this is especially the case in the media. So typically you'd see a lifestyle section of a newspaper, and it will say, red wine helps you live 10 years longer, or coffee is a remedy for Parkinson's if you have this many cups a day for this long. And again, I think this is really confusing for people, because it may well be that something like red wine or coffee or dark chocolate actually helps some type of lifestyle issue or disease, but then it may actually be negative for other aspects of somebody's health. And I think often people quite understandably can feel quite bewildered. I know that even studying this space, there's a lot of things like the water debate, which water is best for you, that I find still really confusing. And so I think it is really understandable, again, that many people just feel lost. Even if they were to go to the study may actually verify something, but it's actually looking at one aspect of health, not the whole picture.
Yeah, and correlation doesn't always mean causation, which is where a lot of people become confused, because very often you can compare various trends and say, oh, well, look, these people are living longer. Alcohol is a perfect example. It's becoming a controversial subject. But for example, some of the people in blue zones do drink a very good quality red wine, and you could say, oh, well, maybe that's part of why they're living longer. But what do they do when they're drinking the wine? They're doing it with people. So now a lot of people are saying, well, it's not the wine, it's the social connection, because actually the best predictor of a long and happy life, the longest study on this came out of Harvard, and it wasn't how much money you had, it wasn't how much exercise you did, whether you smoked, what you ate, it was the quality of your relationships. So if you had strong, robust relationships, not just with your spouse, but with your friends, for example, and colleagues, then you were much more likely to live a long time.
I want to finish on an idea or a theme. So we've spoken a lot about all the challenges that face individuals when they're accessing or interacting with health information online. Is there merit to this idea of inoculating people or vaccinating people against myth or disinformation online?
Yeah, so there's this theory around inoculation, which is really the metaphor of providing people with a small dose of misinformation, and for ethical reasons, this is very carefully presented. And the idea is that by showing them, the techniques, the actual persuasive rhetorical techniques, or the actual misinformation itself, that you will then be able to help them become more resistant in the future when they are invariably exposed to misinformation of this kind. And there's been quite a lot of research on this idea of inoculation over the past, say, 5 or 6 years. There's been partnerships, for example, with some major tech companies where they were creating both videos, like educational videos, but also games where they were trying to statistically understand the extent to which it helped people. And I think there's no doubt that for parts of the population, this type of education can be helpful, just as any type of media or health literacy can be helpful. But I think it's just important to be quite aware of who we are trying to assist and target, because they're really, if you look, for example, at the most problematic information, those groups are very unlikely to be convinced through education. They would just see it as part of an agenda, trying to essentially coerce them into thinking in a certain way. And actually, most of the people who really fall for misinformation have some type of personal experience that gives misinformation a sense of authenticity. So maybe they've had a bad experience with a doctor in the past. Maybe it was a family member who had a really negative experience. And so we find that trust, which is so central to this discussion, often comes from a deep-rooted experience with the healthcare system. And that's quite difficult to overcome with some type of inoculation. So yes, to answer your question, I think it can be effective for some people. But as a broad strategy, trying to immunize the population like a MMR vaccine would, I don't think it's a silver bullet.
So we work a lot with life science companies, pharma companies in particular. We've already spoken about the challenges that they have in engaging with disinformation online. Could this be a way that those type of companies could help?
I mean, of course it could. I think, so what's really important is inoculation, in terms of the terminology, is seen as a form of pre-bunking. And the important distinction there is with debunking. So debunking, I'm sure you've all come across it before. It's where somebody will discuss a certain myth, or maybe it's a health myth or type of misinformation, and then they will debunk it. They'll show that it's not true, right? And this can be very useful as an online strategy to garner a large following. People love it, right? There's a whole lot of features that platforms like TikTok have, where they have duets and stitches, and you can show somebody promoting something and then you'll kind of mock them often and then say like, this isn't true, and have a little bit of a narrative voiceover. I've always found that quite concerning, because as somebody who researches the space, I think for the most vulnerable populations and the people who actually need the most support, you're just shaming them. And I don't think anything good comes of it. And a lot of the anti-vaccine research that I've looked at is this constant ideological battle over identities and beliefs, that this debunking just actually accentuates the polarization between these groups. And so I've always seen it as a bit of a cheap way, really, to build a following. And I'm so sure you can say I'm not huge on it as a strategy. I think pre-bunking is a nice antidote to that, because you're trying to inform people ahead of time of something. But again, what I'd highlight is it's useful for some parts of the population. But when people actually have quite entrenched views, that's where I think it's just more difficult to access those people.
What other things can we do to help people be able to identify, ethical, reliable, accurate health information online?
That's a good question. We talked earlier about the fact that I've just come back from a lifestyle medicine conference, and we actually talked about social media, because the danger is there are a lot of even medical professionals online who are implying that they're giving lifestyle medicine advice, but they don't have any credentials, and their views aren't backed by any kind of professional body like the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine, for example. And ultimately what they're doing is giving us a bad name, which is really frustrating. So we came to the conclusion that if you can't beat them, you should join them. And really in many ways, medical professionals sort of have an obligation to start showing up, which was something you would never imagine at medical school. One day you'd be told you need to get onto TikTok and Instagram to start swaying the opinion. But I think maybe that is something we need to do, that we need a cultural shift, and we need to start inviting medical professionals to engage online, and maybe there need to be incentives for people to do that. So maybe it actually needs to be part of your paid role, especially if you're an academic doctor, and you need to be protected in doing that. And maybe we need to start to have clear ways of signaling who these individuals are. So you've got the blue tick on Instagram that essentially just says you are who you say you are, but they don't ask for your degree or anything. Maybe they need to take it one step above that and actually have a blue tick but also a green tick. So if you're an academic or a professional, the green tick means you've shown Meta your degree and you can confirm you are who you say you are.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I remember about 4 years ago, I was part of a select inquiry into mis and disinformation and online radicalization. And one of the proposals I had was to have some form of verification for medical professionals where you could clearly identify who was an expert. And the problem with that, of course, is that during the pandemic, many of the people who were peddling the most problematic information were medical professionals. And so it just became very difficult, even with that form of verification, to be able to understand which voices to trust. You go on X today, and actually most people who have verification are those figures. So I've become somewhat disillusioned with that as a solution, even though originally I had thought that would be useful. And the other thing I'd say is I think there are people in the space who are doing really good work. So Dr. Mike, for example, even though he does increasingly use debunking, which I'm not huge on, he, I think, is very skillful in his social media use. He's a medical doctor in the US. He, I think, does a fantastic job discussing very controversial issues with empathy, with nuance, to highlight various sides of an argument, not just pushing a kind of very reductive view about whether it be, vaccines or a form of medication. And really what I would come back to is this idea about empathy. Like, I think it's so crucial. Again, the big reason that I'm critical of debunking is because ultimately I think it shows very little empathy. It stigmatizes somebody, it shames them, and it really belittles them. Whereas actually most of us, if we were totally honest, are still confused about a lot of things, and science does change. And actually to connect with people and to really try to understand why they hold a certain view rather than demonize them, I think is a really useful starting point to actually be able to change.
And is there something to be said for a personal responsibility to amplify those sources that are valid and should be trusted?
Yeah, but my first thought is I also think there's a huge responsibility on the part of tech platforms not to actually permit it. I couldn't go on TV and sell a breakfast cereal and allege that it cures cancer and autism. And we have people doing that on TikTok. And I don't know how it's permitted. I have such issues with this. Obviously, the jurisdiction can be difficult because a lot of these content creators operate in the US and they're not based here. But the problem is they are amplified here. Yeah. The voices are amplified. The products are amplified. The products can be purchased from an EU or UK residents. And so I think there is actually, yes, personal responsibility can be a component, but I would refrain from putting all of the responsibility on the consumer, because I think these tech platforms and governments actually have a huge obligation to create safe spaces for people.
So to your point about the States and the amplification of content that comes out of there that goes global, the same premise goes for life science companies as well. So they are allowed in the States to communicate directly to patients. So they can do that within that part of the world. And perhaps there is an opportunity for them to be able to, or there is a responsibility of those within that geography to be aware of that and therefore perhaps use that to for good or for value, as we were saying, in terms of amplifying trusted sources or valid sources of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, if you're working in the space and you see something being presented inaccurately and you have a voice online, it makes sense to communicate that. But again, I would highlight the previous point about amplification. It's not an even playing field. And yes, part of it is your online following, but there's, especially with these short video platforms, algorithmically much more that goes into amplification and communicating a message. And yeah, that's where I would see this as there's no silver bullet. It's not one individual or one company's responsibility. There's multiple partners that need to play a role, and I would include in that governments, health organizations, and tech companies.
And life science companies. I'll add those. And doctors. Okay, so final thoughts. Anything you want to add or finish with? Any advice, any guidance for people watching this? Anything that you really want them to take away?
I just want to urge the public to recognise that medicine is going through something of a metamorphosis at the moment. I don't think it's going to be recognisable in the next 10 years. And in many ways it already isn't, but it just, a lot of what we're starting to learn about things like the gut microbiome and obesity research, they just haven't infiltrated the mainstream just yet. And my point is that actually when you're looking for lifestyle advice, whether you're getting that from a fitfluencer or someone who is apparently a medical professional, just bear in mind that whoever's giving you that advice, they're giving you medical advice. It doesn't matter if they say, well, is it just as a disclaimer, I'm not a doctor, you have to go see your own doctor about this. They're influencing you, and I just want everyone to look at information with a critical eye and remember not everything is as it seems. The research that's being cited, you don't know who's paid for that research to come about. You don't know whether that influencer has paid for followers, and so just because they might look legitimate because they've got 500,000 followers, that doesn't mean that they are. That's my key point.
Yeah, I think without creating fear and massive distrust, the one thing I would encourage anyone who is online and following accounts to bear in mind is really to think about why people are communicating a certain message. And anybody who has an online voice, whether it's us, whether it is somebody who is promoting a health product or a political product, is in some way trying to communicate a message. It doesn't necessarily mean, again, that it's nefarious, but it's usually about social, commercial, political gain. And I think it's really useful just to understand the purpose and perspective of the creators that you follow online. It doesn't have to be in a reductive sense that everybody who is actually selling a product is trying to mislead you. But if you can't understand why somebody is producing content, that's a problem. And so I think it's just being very discerning about your information diet, what you're consuming, who you follow, and what they are actually using their audience for.
Thank you for joining us. We hope these episodes have inspired you to reflect and sparked some important conversations.